Hello, and welcome to the webinar presented in collaboration with the Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia MGMAs. We would like to thank today's webinar host, the New York MGMA. My name's Erin, and I'll be your host today. I would like to thank our sponsor, the Milmick Insurance Company. They are New York MGMA's webinar and exclusive professional liability sponsor. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. Robert Rosenzweig is a Senior Vice President and the National Cyber Risk Practice Leader at Risk Strategies. In this role, Rob oversees all of the firm's cyber professionals and works directly with the firm's clients and prospects on creating comprehensive, customized coverage for their data security, privacy, and errors and omissions exposures. Rob's also responsible for coordinating the firm's overall cyber strategy nationally. A published writer and frequent interview subject on cyber liability topics, he also has participated on panels and led seminars on a variety of related topics. Rob currently holds the Cyber COPE insurance certification from Chubb and Carnegie Mellon University and a designation as a registered professional liability underwriter. Rob received his Bachelor of Arts degree in Government and Economics from Hamilton College. Thank you very much for joining us today, Robert.
My pleasure. Thanks for the introduction, Erin, and thank you all for signing into the webinar and giving us your time and attention today. Happy to be with you all. Wish we could be in person, but such is the world these days. So Erin was kind enough to read my bio and probably more than you all needed to know, but just for a couple quick background on risk strategies and a little bit more context on what we do and what I do specifically at Risk Strategies before we jump into the presentation. For those of you who aren't familiar with Risk Strategies is a full-service insurance brokerage firm founded in 1997. At this point, we are about the 13th largest insurance broker in the United States with over 90 offices, and we are responsible for placing $4.5 billion in premium into the marketplace with insurance carriers on behalf of our clients. We work with our clients in all areas of risk, so that includes private client, all commercial business needs, including in the healthcare space, professional liability for physicians and physician practices and hospitals, as well as in the employee benefits world. In my role at Risk Strategies, really what cyber risk in the insurance context means, I work with our clients and have a team of specialist brokers that work with our clients to better understand what your business is, what areas of risk you have that expose you to data security issues, privacy issues, and the threat of technology disruption, helping identify strategies to improve those areas of risk and reduce the probability and at least the cost and complexity of an incident. And of course, we work with our clients to secure cyber liability insurance policies that help you both in terms of giving you access to the vendors that you need, as well as the financial risk transfer reimbursement for the costs associated with investigating and responding to any sort of data security incident, as well as any liability that might come from that incident. So today, what we're going to talk about is an overview of what we're seeing in the way of threats that are impacting all healthcare organizations, including physician practices, some of the regulatory issues that further make this a complicated topic. And we'll give you a little bit of a brief on what we're seeing in the insurance marketplace, how that's changing, and how insurance coverage has proved to be valuable for many of our healthcare clients when addressing this risk. So I always like to start these presentations by doing a bit of level setting in terms of the reality of what we're seeing in the world. I think the perception for many when thinking about cyber risk, cybersecurity, and data breaches is what you read about or see on the news, on TV. And what tends to get covered with greater focus is the mega breaches that are impacting Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies, and certainly we've seen a great deal of stories about ransomware hitting municipalities and school districts in the last couple of years. This data that we're sharing with you on the screen right now is courtesy of a firm called Net Diligence, which is a vendor that works with the insurance community and on an annual basis gathers all of the claims data from the insurance carriers that offer cyber insurance, anonymizes that data, and publishes a report that help us to identify trends and educate ourselves as well as our customers. So right now what we're looking at is an industry breakdown of the types of industries that have been most heavily targeted by cybercrime from 2015 to 2019. This is not surprising in a lot of ways, as you can see in the relevance to you all today. Healthcare is the largest piece of that pie, with over 28% of incidents that we saw in that period of time being targeting healthcare organizations specifically. But I would say that this pie chart looks a lot different now than it might have looked 2 or 3 years ago, in that we're starting to see the threat actors, the cyber criminals, really more broadly target other industries that don't have as significant amount of personal identifiable or personal health information in the way that healthcare, financial services, and retail industries typically do. So manufacturing, as an example, would not have been on this pie chart 3-4 years ago. And we'll talk about why that is, and also why that's still relevant to healthcare in a couple minutes. In terms of size, and that's the other point here that's important to understand and educate yourselves on relative to what you see in the news on a daily basis. This is not a Fortune 1000 issue. In 2018, 54% of the incidents that we saw were impacting companies under 50 million in revenues. And when you factor in and truly look at small and middle market companies as a whole, 300 million and under, we're talking about 76% of the incidents we saw in 2018. We should have data for 2019 in the next few weeks, and I expect it to look very much the same or trending even more towards being a small and middle market company issue. The world of cybercrime is very much representative of what our world and economy looks like. You have different criminal groups with different motivations, different budgets, different levels of sophistication. And while one could argue that gaining access to a multi-billion-dollar company might be more lucrative for a criminal, it's also a far more costly proposition and investment in time to gain access to a company that has a significant spend on their IT security budget and really has hardened their security posture. The outlook that we're seeing from cyber criminals that really is driving what this data looks like is, for many small and middle market businesses that aren't investing in cybersecurity, aren't training their employees, are reliant on vendors, the score might not be as big, but it's far easier for the criminals to gain access to small and middle market businesses. So just want to talk a little bit about the world right now. We are seeing a significant uptick in cybercrime and data breaches in 2020. There probably is some correlation to COVID, but a lot of these thematically are probably issues that were presenting themselves as the world changes and the economy develops and we all become more reliant on technology more than ever. But most companies have had to shift rapidly from being physically on premises to having a lot of their employees working remotely in a period of a week or 2 weeks. This put a significant strain on IT teams, operations, infrastructure. We've seen repeated instances where the implementation and deployment of of conferring that remote access to employees was not set up properly, and that's led to vulnerabilities that cyber criminals can exploit. We've also seen instances where a lot of the controls that companies that really have done the right things historically to prevent incidents have done were really policy and procedure based. So employee training and having the right processes to have employees verify that a particular request or an email that they're receiving is accurate and legitimate, and they're not doing anything that they shouldn't be doing. And those policies and procedures relied on employees being physically together, right? I could walk down the hall to Aaron's office and say, hey, Aaron, did you actually send me this email? Did you want me to wire $200,000 to vendor X? With everyone being dispersed remotely, sometimes some of those basic blocking and tackling and controls has fallen by the wayside. And when you layer on top of that employees working in home environments where you might have some level of distraction, kids running around, homes, virtual schooling, whatever the case may be, that's just another way that people can be a little bit lackadaisical unintentionally and click on a link, download an attachment, or voluntarily offer up their credentials and allow cyber criminals that initial point of entry. But as I mentioned, all businesses are becoming increasingly reliant on technology and outsourced vendors. As I'm sure you can attest to in your world, with electronic health record platforms and other applications that are really critical to what you do. Without access to those systems and that data, companies are crippled. And especially now that we're remote, a lot of any business continuity planning that we had done that relied on redundancies that were a little bit more pencil and paper oriented just don't work as well, and that's given cyber criminals even more leverage in this environment. So segueing to what that translates to, the biggest issue by far and away that we're seeing in the world of cybercrime is ransomware. Ransomware was in Q1 of 2020, we saw 25% more ransomware attacks in the insurance industry than we saw in all of 2019. The average ransom demand, and this data is a little dated at this point, was just under $300,000, but we're regularly seeing ransom demands that are multi-million dollars. We've seen ransom demands as high as $16 million, and regularly are seeing ransom demands that get paid that are a few million dollars. In fact, we had a client about 2 or 3 weeks ago that ultimately was able to negotiate a demand down, but had to pay a $5.6 million ransom demand. One of the reasons I should say that ransomware has become so prevalent is cyber criminals always seem to be one step ahead of us in both the security that we're implementing, but also strategically. The reason we saw that different distribution on the pie chart in terms of industry, data like personal identifiable information, credit card numbers, have become less valuable for cyber criminals to sell on the black market. But by gaining access to a company, encrypting data, and withholding access to key applications that you need to run your business, and in the case of healthcare, it's not just about running your business, but it's also about administering care, and you have a life and death element there. There's greater leverage for them to quickly monetize the level of access that they're able to gain. And with that increased reliance on technology that we just talked about, they've got the leverage, and companies are forced to pay. And in terms of expanding the attack surface for cyber criminals, while they historically were probably more focused on targeting healthcare, financial services, retail, like I said, because of the wealth of personal information. Now they can go after any company, any industry, and not even worry about it, because this type of scheme is going to be lucrative regardless of the industry. Whereas if their motivation was stealing personal information, it wasn't going to be particularly lucrative to go after a manufacturing company that doesn't have any personal identifiable information. The ransom demands are typically being asked for in digital currency, most frequently Bitcoin. 20 to 50 Bitcoin is based on current conversion rates to kind of correlates to that 275K average. And these ransomware attacks are really sophisticated, the type of malware that they're using, in that we're often seeing that not only are the criminals able to encrypt your actual live production environment, but if you are doing nightly backups of your data and storing those off-site in the cloud, very often they're able to encrypt your backups as well. So again, increasing leverage. If both your production environment and your backup data are encrypted, you have no choice very often but to pay the ransom demand. And the last thing I would highlight on this slide that is very scary is we're seeing an increasing number of criminal groups that are engaging in this strategy that we call double ransom. So they'll execute the malware, encrypt your data, ask for a ransom demand in order to give you the decryption key to regain access to your data in your system. And then regardless of whether or not you pay that ransom, on their way out, after you've finished your negotiations, they will send a message and communicate that, oh, by the way, we actually stole a handful of your data while we were in your systems. And if you don't pay us a second ransom, we're going to publish that data on the internet, causing you reputational harm and potentially causing some regulatory and legal implications. So we have even seen instances where our clients have been forced to pay not one, but two ransoms to remediate a situation. So not to get too into the weeds and technical here, but again, this is the basic trajectory of how cyber criminals actually do it. And the point I was making here is, there's initially, the initial point of entry tends to be one of two things. There's an open port that they're able to exploit and gain access to through sort of a brute force attack, which what that means in plain English, remote access to your servers wasn't set up properly, and there's an open port that the hackers are able to gain access through. And the other typical point of entry, which is tougher to defend against because it's more of a human capital issue as opposed to a security control, is an employee clicks on a link, they download an attachment, or they receive some sort of prompt asking for their username and password to the network, and they voluntarily give those credentials to the cyber criminal. Once they get in, not only do they deploy the ransomware malware, but they use what are called command and control bots, which allow them to scour your network for other data that might be valuable, including the credentials that they need to not only encrypt your production environment, but to encrypt your backups as well. So it's pretty scary stuff. They're very sophisticated. They're very good at what they do. And there are some groups that aren't as good as what they do, but the even scarier part is these criminals can actually buy the ransomware malware from other criminal groups on the dark web. And some of them don't know how to use it very well, but they're just following instructions out of a box and trying to scattershot find ways to target small and middle market businesses. So that's really what I wanted to cover today in terms of the threat landscape. I think it's important to understand the way things are trending. Obviously, other types of attacks, business email compromise attacks, schemes where criminals are trying to convince you to wire funds out the door or manipulating a legitimate invoice are still prevalent, but ransomware is by far and away the biggest issue. So segueing into sort of the next logical topic for understanding the landscape here is, why do we have to care if something happens beyond the interruption and the financial implications to our business. And the short answer there is the regulatory landscape. And obviously in your world in healthcare, this is something you're tremendously familiar with. But in addition to regulations for how you secure personal health information under HIPAA, all 50 states in the US have laws that dictate what a company has to do in the event that there has been potentially unauthorized access to any data in your care, custody, or control. And the challenging part for companies to navigate is it's not where your business is domiciled that dictates what state laws you're beholden to. It's where the individuals whose data may have been compromised reside that dictate your response. So even if your practice is domiciled in New York or any of the other states that are participating on today's webinar, if you have patients that reside in, say, California as their main residency, you would potentially have to understand what your obligations are under California law. And the main trend that I want to make clear today is the regulatory landscape is stringent, and we see it tightening up even more over the next couple of years. CCPA, which I'll talk about very briefly in a second, is the California Consumer Protection Act, and that is a law that California enacted in January of this year, and it is by far and away the most consumer-friendly privacy law on the books in the US. And the expectation is that other states, New York included, will probably follow suit in fairly short order, enacting laws that are pretty similar in scope and feel to the California Consumer Protection Act. And on the topic of HIPAA, regardless of whether you've done the right things, as some of you may know, typically what we see is OCR and HHS will tend to investigate any incident where over 500 individuals have been compromised or potentially compromised. So even if they don't levy fines and penalties, there's still complexities to navigate and cost associated with responding to a formal order of investigation. So not going to spend too much time on the California Consumer Protection Act, because I don't believe we have any practices on the line today that are domiciled in California. But again, you might have some patients that are residents of California, but regardless, important to understand just given the way things are trending in other states. And the real two main changes that we saw with California Consumer Protection Act are as follows. This is the first law that has set a minimum statutory damage per resident that's been impacted. So historically, plaintiffs' law firms have not been very eager to file lawsuits on data breaches where there weren't millions and millions of individuals impacted. And the reason for this was the hurdle that they've had challenges sort of overcoming is proving what the actual injury in fact is to the individual whose information was compromised. So for example, if my credit card number was compromised, my bank's going to back out those charges. I'm going to get a new credit card. There was no financial loss I suffered. So what's my injury? So as a result, the plaintiff's bar really was only going after those mega breaches because they weren't very confident that they could get a jury. Apologies, there's an ambulance going outside my window, such as working from home. But they were not very confident that they would get a jury verdict on a case or even get to a jury trial, given the inability to prove injury in fact. But with a large breach where there's a lot of dollars at stake, the defendant, the company that had the incident, was more likely to want to settle. Well, now when California set this minimum statutory damage threshold of $100 per individual, our expectation is now plaintiffs bars know, the plaintiff bar will know, regardless of how many individuals were impacted in a breach, here's the floor of what I can ask for if I file a lawsuit. So that should, in all likelihood, will bring the risk of litigation and class action litigation following a data breach downstream a little bit, and make small and middle market companies more susceptible to lawsuits. And then the other thing I would point out here is this law, unlike many others in the states, not only sets requirements that companies have to follow when they've had an incident in terms of how much time you have to notify and what your obligations are, but actually set requirements about what you have to do in terms of what information you're collecting from individuals, how you're storing that information, and how you have to be transparent in making consumers aware of what you're doing with their data and how you're storing that data. And California has the ability to investigate and levy fines and penalties for that as well, not even just if you've had a breach. So the last topic for today is the insurance marketplace. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic at this moment. We've got a very crowded and noisy marketplace in that you have 500 plus insurers that are in the business of offering cyber insurance. Pretty concentrated in terms of the carriers that are doing this at scale and know what they're doing. But for you as a policyholder or prospective policyholder, it's very challenging to know what you're getting and if it really meets your needs, because there's not a great deal of consistency from insurance carrier to insurance carrier. But we are seeing the market harden, even though there are so many carriers that want to and are eager to write cyber business. So because of ransomware mainly, we've been seeing rate increases in Q3 of 2020, which I noticed there's a typo on the slide there, which I apologize for, tracking it at 15%. So carriers, while are bullish on the prospects of writing cyber insurance business, they're starting to pay far more losses than anticipated, and we're starting to see rates increase up as a result of that. The other trend that I think is important and probably relevant for the healthcare world, historically over the last 5-7 years, it had become somewhat commonplace for carriers in other lines of business, your property insurance, your general liability insurance, maybe even your medical malpractice insurance, to offer small sublimits for cyber threats. With the landscape being far more severe in terms of the claim payouts, we're already starting to see this, and we expect it to get worse, where carriers are likely to scale back, if not exclude coverage for cyber threats under other policies entirely. So really, the conversation we're having with a lot of our clients is if you determine that you do have some risk and exposure to data security and privacy issues, the really true only way to address this and be confident that you're addressing this on a go-forward basis sustainably is to buy true standalone cyber insurance policy, as opposed to relying on an endorsement or some sort of silent coverage grant in another policy that you might buy. I'm not going to bore you with some of the coverage terminology in today's conversation, but these are examples of some of the terminology that can be inconsistent from carrier to carrier, and some of the policy language or coverage enhancements, I should say, that have become more commonplace in the market, that if you're thinking about buying cyber insurance, these are some of the terms you should make sure are included on your policy, and some of the questions you should be asking, such as claims handling. What's the carrier's approach to claims handling? What vendors do they use? These are all important questions that you should be asking your broker or the insurance carrier that you're working with. And I believe we will provide a copy of these slides as well, so you'll have a list of some of these terms that you'll have at your disposal. So what is covered under a cyber policy? Cyber insurance is a bit unique in that it is one of few, if not the only type of insurance policy that covers what we call both first party and third party coverage. And what that means in plain English is first party coverage means direct reimbursement for expense you incur versus third party, meaning somebody sued you, they made a demand against you, you have costs that you incurred to hire an attorney and the potential for damages or settlement that might be awarded against you. So if you think about this linearly from the right to the left of the screen, the most important coverage under a cyber policy is the event management expenses. So these are the costs and access to the vendors that will help you investigate and respond to any suspected or actual incident. So that could include specialized legal counsel that knows what your obligations are under all of those state and federal and international laws. It's the forensic investigative firms that can actually come in, look at the logs, look at your servers, your devices, and determine how the bad guys got in, what data they accessed, and if they took any data out. And in the case of ransomware, negotiate with the cyber criminal and actually pay that ransom demand on your behalf if you determine you want to do so. If there's a notice obligation, this also includes public relations as well as the actual cost to notify individuals that have been impacted and offer them credit monitoring or remediation. We've talked a lot about ransomware. The actual payment of the ransom demand is covered by insurance policies, and they pay that loss directly in Bitcoin or whatever other digital currency. But oftentimes with a ransomware attack, whether you choose to pay or not, and there's nothing in the policy that forces you to pay, the collateral damage is you've got network interruption, meaning your systems are down, you don't have access to data, and that causes a financial loss to your business. You're losing profit, you're incurring extra expense to get your systems back up and running. That's all insurable under a cyber policy. Similarly, data restoration, if your data is corrupted, it's been damaged, you incur costs to replace or reproduce that data, that's insurable under a cyber policy as well. And then last but not least, on the left side of the screen, and our hope is we never get to this point if we handle the incident quickly and effectively, bringing those expert vendors in from the onset. But if there's a regulatory inquiry from OCR or a state attorney general, or you are hit with a lawsuit, class action lawsuit or otherwise, the policy will pick up the costs you incur to hire a lawyer to defend you and any damages, judgment, settlement, fines, penalties that are awarded against you from that action. So, this is somewhat fluid, obviously, as losses continue to mount and carriers rethink their strategy a bit. But these are this is the general way underwriters think about and determine their willingness to offer coverage and the pricing for coverage. The main driver of price is the financial size of your business, your gross revenues, but underwriters also want to know how much personal health information do you estimate you have? How many unique individuals do you have data on? But the questions on most cyber insurance applications and how exhaustive the application is depends on the specific size of your business and the particular carriers you're thinking about working with. But the questions they're going to ask around people, processes, and technology. What are you doing around employee training? How much information do you have? Where do you store it? Who has access to it? And then what you would expect an underwriter to want to know about your IT infrastructure. I will make very clear though, and this is oftentimes a misconception, there is no, and particularly true for small businesses, but true across the board, even for Fortune 1000 companies, there are no insurance carriers that require any sort of invasive audit or assessment of your system it's an application that you have to complete that's really more of a self-assessment. Obviously, you have to complete that accurately and honestly, but there's no significant process or friction involved with the process. We talked about this a little bit, but I like to really emphasize this, so I'll bring it up one more time. The value of cyber insurance, like any insurance policy, is the financial risk transfer. But I think arguably even more importantly, is the access to the vendors that can help you deal with those event management expenses that we just talked about. So, what we typically seen with clients and prospective clients that we've talked to, and this is particularly true with smaller and middle market businesses, you don't necessarily have relationships with hyper specialized vendors that can do the work that counsel and the forensics firms that the carriers have contracted to do this work. And the pricing that they've agreed to is discounted from what those vendors would cost if you contacted them directly. So really, you can almost think of the premium that you pay to your insurance carrier as a retainer to have those expert vendors available, and you pick up the bat phone when something happens, and they're going to be there because they're contractually committed to be there by your insurance carrier. Many insurance carriers and brokers in this space also now are offering complimentary and discounted resources to allow you to be proactive and improve your risk management, which obviously is mutually beneficial to everyone involved. So if you have, that's an important consideration when determining whether or not you want to buy cyber insurance coverage and whom you buy it from, understanding what resources they have, because you might be able to do things that you want to do from a security standpoint that you haven't been able to do, or at least defray some costs that you're already incurring and further leverage that spend on the cyber insurance policy. So again, just a few tips that are kind of basic blocking and tackling, but things that are important for any business and even all of you individually in your personal lives. If I were to highlight a couple things on this slide in particular, it would probably be 2 and 3. Be suspicious of everything. Look at emails. Make sure that the sender is actually the email address of the individual that you expect that email to be coming from. Make sure it's somebody that you're corresponding with. Pick up the phone or whatever means of communication to verify whether it's legitimate correspondence and a legitimate request. But multi-factor authentication is really, really important for any business to implement, regardless of size. So for anyone that's not familiar with that terminology, it's just having a secondary means of authenticating your login attempt. So it could be a text message on your phone or an app that gives you a unique code that rotates every couple of minutes. And the reason this is so important, even if a cyber criminal is able to gain one of your employees' credentials, if they don't have that secondary means of authenticating the login attempt, it might prevent them from getting into your network, which could prevent a ransomware attack or at least reduce the cost and complexity of responding to one of these incidents. So all of these are great tips, but those are the 2 that I would really think seriously about. So with that, we have about 20 minutes left. So happy to take some questions, as many as there are, and if not, give you back a little bit of your time. And again, I thank you all for your time and attention, and thank you to Aaron and the New York MGMA for having me today.
Are there any questions for Rob right now? There aren't any in the box at the moment. I'm going to give everybody a few seconds here to put some questions in our chat box if any pop in their mind. We're getting some thanks. Rob, Liz says thank you.
I'll take that.
Okay, Rachel says, what are some questions that would be important to ask vendors in relation to cybersecurity?
Yeah, so it's a great question because at the end of the day, a vendor is only if you entrust your data to a vendor, it's still ultimately your responsibility if that vendor has an issue. So it depends on the vendor you're using because obviously some are more forthcoming than others, but to the extent that they're willing to share any sort of security audits that they've carried out, like a SOC 2 audit, that would be great if they're willing to share that information. But I would definitely if you're able to, in the negotiation of the contract, try to get a strong indemnity from them in terms of what their responsibility would be if they have a data security incident where your data is impacted, and also require some evidence from them that they themselves are securing a cyber insurance policy, because you want to ensure that they're going to have that financial backstop, because given that that's their nature of operations, if they have an incident, it's not going to be just your data that's impacted, but all of their clients. So there's going to be a lot of similarly situated companies lining up to go after them to recoup some of the expense that they've incurred.
Hey, Rob, can you flip back to your last slide?
Sure thing.
Mark, you want to look at that Mark asked to review it a second. Mark, if you want to review that and ask a specific question about it, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Sure. And in the meantime, I saw there's a couple other questions that
yeah,
came
I'm looking
in.
at that too. So Christopher.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Rob.
Christopher asked, how does one determine how much cyber insurance to purchase? At the end of the day, it's more art than science. I mean, I would ask the question of your broker, because there's a couple different things you can look at, right? We often look at peer benchmarking. So what is similarly sized and physician practices, or whatever the nature of your particular operations are, what do they do? That's one useful metric. But depending on your financial size, how much data you have, there is some modeling that can be done to determine limit adequacy. It's not 100% accurate, but we've been doing this for long enough now that we know, if you look like X and you've got this much data and you have a truly catastrophic loss, this is what the likely cost would potentially be. And then I saw there were a couple questions that also came in on the Q&A. The question about, do you suggest phishing monitoring and employee training program? 100%. That's probably the multi-factor authentication and security awareness training would be the biggest things I could possibly recommend. For anybody not familiar with phishing testing, so there are a number of vendors that will actually phish your employees. So send them an email that is spoofed and track who clicks on it. And yes, they're going to get a little bit admonished for clicking on it, but the real intent there is they get enrolled in secondary training if they do click on it, so they're better prepared to understand how to identify malicious emails in the future.
And Kim said you recommend a separate policy instead of all inclusion, correct?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, our expectation is it's not highly likely that if you have some throw-in coverage on another type of insurance policy, that it's going to be available for that much longer. And at some level, you get what you pay for, right? I mean, if this is something, and I'm not saying everybody needs to view this as a top risk for their business, many of our clients do. And, if you do view it in that regard, it's a pretty safe assessment without doing a great deal of due diligence that an endorsement on another type of policy is not going to be as comprehensive or favorable to you as paying for a standalone policy, nor are the limits going to be as sufficient, particularly when claims like ransomware attacks are much more costly than other types of cyber incidents that we'd seen in the last few years.
I think on your last slide there, Mark is asking for some clarification on those. I think these are just good general advice for all of us personally, and then extend into all of our practices, correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And as I said, these will be the recording of today's presentation will be sent out to you, and also the slides themselves. We'll send you a PDF of those, so you'll be able to review these, at your leisure along with the recording. So I hope that that's helpful to everyone. I thank everybody for all of the really good questions. Rob, did you have anything else?
No, again, just thank you for your time. Very much appreciated.
I appreciate your time, and it was great to work with you and Jen from Risk Strategies. Thank you all very much, and you all have a safe weekend and a safe Thanksgiving holiday. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon.